Thank you very much for that. My video turned off to help with the bandwidth for everybody, but I thought I'd just turn it on to let you know that I am sitting here for this moment in time. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present to everyone today. It is a collective input, and I do have to acknowledge everyone who contributed to this presentation on looking at the impact of COVID-19 on small-scale fisheries in South Africa in particular. So just to give a little bit of background and context, that globally and in South Africa, the sector itself is marginalized and very vulnerable. And there are high levels of poverty and extreme events such as these, such as the COVID-19 that has significant impact on the small-scale fisheries. In South Africa in particular, and I'm sure in other parts of the world globally, the small-scale fishery sector is rooted in local households and communities, providing food, nutrition, and livelihoods for families. Many of these communities' cultures and their customary rights and their systems of local ecological knowledge is intertwined with the interactions with the local environment upon which they depend. There is a need for this transdisciplinary, also intersectoral approaches to take a look at the impacts of COVID emergencies and this pandemic across these various aspects of the fish's identities, and understanding that there's also a point of human rights that needs to be looked at. So to give you a little overview of South Africa itself as well, in South Africa, small-scale fisheries can range from the traditional rural-based fishers that fish mainly for subsistence to those that are small-scale artisanal fishers that fish from the shore or at sea using a variety of boats and gear types. Women also contribute to the small-scale fishery sector. However, they are largely invisible, but they play a vital and active role, particularly pre- and post-harvest activities. Much of this commercial sector, however, dominates the fishing sector as a whole. This is despite policy development as a result of an equity court ruling that this small-scale fishery sector has to be recognized and protected, and a small-scale fishery policy was implemented and put forward in 2012. It has been very slow to implement, and this has also resulted in some of the reasons why the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted so significantly on this vulnerable group. So the pandemic itself has also highlighted some of these inequalities within the South African society and has brought forward many of these risks to these fishers. So even during the COVID lockdown and the pandemic and the response, the small-scale fisheries sector has been considered an essential service. So that means that there is access to fish and to being able to fish for their livelihoods. However, there have been some of these challenges in the implementation of these, of them being able to access their livelihood, particularly in the context of the limited operationalization and recognition of customary fishing rights of the community-based approaches to fisheries management due to the lengthy implementation of the small-scale fisheries policy. There also has been an apparent lack of coherent approaches to local level enforcement of the lockdown measures among the different enforcement bodies, which has led to some of the arrests that we have seen during the lockdown period. Valentino sort of intimated that I would be mentioning some of this with regards to the militarization and the police not necessarily having full information of what is allowed and isn't allowed in terms of permits. Lockdown measures also have prevented participation by the small-scale fishery sector in decision-making with other developments that affect their livelihoods. For example, mining, So in terms of the interested and affected parties and stakeholder participation, it is important that they are able to participate, but due to different reasons, they are not able to participate during the lockdown period. And it also has paused the ongoing process to legally recognize the small-scale fishery cooperatives, which is a component of the small-scale fisheries policy. So during putting this presentation together, we got input from the fishers directly, who sent us voice notes and WhatsApp messages and small little videos. And we really would like to acknowledge their contribution and present their perspective in this presentation. So one of the contributions and what I've expressed in the next couple of slides are just excerpts from these presentations. They really provided rich information and a lot of detail that I couldn't share right now due to time. So Hilda, who is the coordinator for a group called The Collective, works across the different regions within South Africa, acknowledged, and we're happy to hear that the essential services were recognized. However, it has met with uncomfort and unease, or not knowing where does this put them and what do they need to do. And there are two examples that she gives in her narrative. One of them is reflected in the slide, the other isn't, and that is around the rock lobster, which dominates an international market, and having access to these markets during the lockdown has really impacted on them negatively. The other is the snook, which is another species that they access, and it took a protracted negotiations for them to be able to get the necessary permits to be able to legally travel and access the resource, which took a lot of their time. And because they have been impacted by the implementation of the small-scale fisheries policy, they're not yet registered as a cooperative. And that means that then the COVID-19 has now resulted in additional delays. And Sindisu, who I'm hoping is also has managed to join us, has also provided some rich information about how this lockdown has impacted them, and mainly around the permits being not registered, not being all of them belonging or having these cooperatives in place as they go forward. But one of the points that he also brings across is that the need for access to clean water, so that they can wash their hands regularly, and it's difficult for them, particularly in the rural areas. And also that some of the mechanisms that have been put in place by government to help businesses, they cannot access due to not being registered as yet. Alroy and Fikile, who also provided some information mainly around telling their story about the documentation, the perceived legality of documentation and the permits that they have, also that many of the other local implementers of these permits do not actually understand or have the knowledge to be able to help them be legal. So for many who are in these rural areas who do not have access to IT, to fax machines, or able to travel to go and deal with these permits, it's very difficult for them in their context, or having access to resources. So this brings us to the importance of understanding that we cannot only look at the governance structures without understanding context, and particularly also understanding the socioeconomic rights and the impact on the socioeconomic rights for shocks such as this pandemic. So for many, it's also the access to food and nutrition, adequate housing, the water and sanitation is quite important in the context of COVID-19. We also consider that the number of communities that have no access to safe drinking water, or the ability to make things like ice that could also increase the value and quality of their fish to sell and to share. There is also poor access to infrastructure, particularly in the rural country areas, as you saw by the previous slide, the picture there. They also have low levels of access to digital technology. If we look at it from a perspective of social security and protection, many are dependent on state grants. There are state grants that are available for the elderly, children, and during COVID-19, these have been increased. And there also has been an introduction of a temporary social relief grant for people with no income. However, these grants do still remain low and are inadequate to support these large number of people that depend on these grants, and particularly during a situation as COVID-19. If we look at the employment and labour markets, there seems to, in particular for this small-scale fisheries, they're informal, they're self-employed, some of them are not legally recognized yet, they're not registered, they don't have unemployment insurance, so they do not have access to some of the disaster relief mechanisms that have been put in place. And also women in particular are vulnerable because they are really important in the pre and post harvest, but they are vulnerable in terms of recognizing their labor rights. In terms of conditions, many of the conditions are unhygienic, and in rural areas, children often are the ones who are harvesting the resources in the intertidal zones. What we have also seen is that even though gender-based and gender discrimination in South Africa is quite high comparatively, during the lockdown period we have seen an increase in gender-based violence. And also mentioned earlier in Valentina's presentation, in terms of the cumulative impacts, so many of these small-scale fishers are vulnerable to natural and human risks and impacts, particularly with sea level rise and increase in access to their resources, also being exposed to extreme weather events and not allowing them to go and harvest as regularly as they can. And also they have poor access to health services as well as adequate water supplies, which decreases their resilience in an event as COVID-19. And with a cumulative impact of climate change, will really put them in a more vulnerable state. So as I mentioned, it is really important to see governance together with context. The context matters, and also identifying and knowing and acknowledging the cultural identities associated with being a small-scale fisher. There have been responses and enablers to the COVID-19 situation in South Africa, and particularly by some of the small-scale fishing communities. There has been a revival of the community values and reciprocity. Some of the local communities are distributing fish that they are able to that they have caught, and they are sharing percentages of their catch to the elderly and households that are struggling. Many of the women fish leaders have established food kitchens, sourced donations from affluent residents and communities and municipalities, and are feeding large numbers of families. Food parcels have also been provided by national government for registered fishers in particular. However, this has met with some challenges in distributing food parcels, and also for those fishers who weren't able to register pre the COVID-19 lockdown. And also there have been increased partnerships we have seen between provincial government, NGOs and community-based organizations. So you can see that many of the women are putting food parcels together, cooking food, and then distributing it to the community. One of the other responses has been in terms of a non-profit organization with an app called Abelobi ICT for Fisheries, and they have, with the COVID lockdown, developed a community-supported fishery which enables the public to purchase online from the fishers a catch of the day. So this has helped them and give them access to markets during this period, and it's then sent forward. As a hub, we are also looking at ways and means with our collective to support the small-scale fishers. We have done this so far through supporting communication, in particular through data sharing and airtime, and also coordinating a WhatsApp group with leaders throughout the country. We also are using the expertise and looking at the social capital within the hub to address some of the small-scale fishery challenges. This has mainly been around legal advice for those who have been arrested, and also looking at the structures in communicating the permit conditions for small-scale fishers across the different scales within the country. We also need to look at and understand within a global response, and we thought it was important to reflect upon this within the group in terms of a climate or an environment to share and learn. And it's to also recognize, looking at the Sustainable Development Goal 14.B, which does recognize the need to provide access to small-scale artisanal fishers, that they have access to resources and markets, and how do we address this in a time of a pandemic. Also looking at the FAO small-scale fisheries guidelines, and also looking at the 29 UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which also clarifies human rights and how this applies to small-scale fishers in particular. So to pose a question to the panel and the floor in our reflections as we've gone through this is how to effectively apply some of these international instruments in the context of national fisheries and environmental regulations, and how can this be participatory, integrated, and transform the way that the small-scale fisheries is managed, and also how can organizations within the UN, as for example the FAO, assist in facilitating some of these discussions across the different fisher groups in Africa to build fisher network solidarity, and also provide opportunities to learn on how each and different communities have responded to situations as this COVID-19 pandemic. So I would leave these questions besides for being asked some questions as we move forward. So I'd also just like to acknowledge and say thank you very much for your time and for listening, but I would like to acknowledge as well the contributions made by the small-scale fishers, and for also allowing us to use the photos and the voice messages that they sent us. Thank you very much.